Peter and I first talked about abundance back in 2012, it was this great thing. Like, soon we'll have technology that's going to meet and exceed the basic needs of everyone on the planet. That's like an amazing promise. And we're not mad that 1 million people gained access to electricity, or 2 million, or excuse me, 1 billion people gained access to electricity and 2 billion gained access to clean drinking water in the past 10 years. That's amazing. That's the promise of abundance being fulfilled. But there's this very heavy dark side because of how our brain works that we constantly have to protect against.
And welcome back, everyone, to the Coachful Coaching Leadership Podcast. This is your host, David Fung. And if you remember, I help leaders get unstuck and get out of their own way and get into the mindset that helps them become better leaders. And today, I'm going to read off this biography of my special guest today. My guest today is Stephen Kotler, New York Times bestselling author, award-winning journalist, and one of the world's leading experts on human performance. He's written 17 books, 12 of them bestsellers, earned 3 Pulitzer Prize nominations, and being translated into more than 80 languages. He's the founder and executive director of the Flow Research Collective, a neuroscience research and training organization whose programs have reached Navy SEALs, Olympic athletes, and executive teams at Google, Meta, and Microsoft. His new book, co-authored with Peter Diamandis, is We Are As Gods, and that's what we're talking about today. It's a survival guide for the age of abundance, and it argues the defining bottleneck of this century isn't technology, it's the human brain. Stephen, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me, David.
Yeah. So, We Are As Gods. You see this here? I read the book. I read the book from end to end. I'm a slow reader. It took me about a month in between all the other things I've been doing and traveling and such. You've probably been through this a few times, right? But I'm going to ask you, one of the first things is that when in the book, you're talking about how we have godlike powers, right? The Googles and Zooms of the world, we have phones in our pockets that just give us instant access to anything and everything that we need. But I want to bring up a line that a comedian said that I heard a few years ago. He was talking about how many of us are flying in a tin can 35,000 feet in the air. And yet if we can't get Wi-Fi, we start complaining and swearing and yelling at the flight attendant. I guess when you hear about that, even though we have so much and we're so abundant with things, why do people act like that?
So that's funny. Whenever somebody brings up the Wi-Fi, I think that was Seinfeld, the Wi-Fi story, I'm reminded of the fact that we invented flight. For the first time. We've been trying to fly forever. We invent flight and create the first, airlines. And within 5 years, people want movies on their flight. And in a bunch of different ways, this is you asked a question with a neurobiological answer. It has very little to do with the book, but I'm going to give you the answer because
I did that on purpose.
I think it's sort of important. Yeah. So there's sort of a principle. It's known as repetition suppression. So we essentially start to ignore and not notice repeated stimuli. So the first time you see the Grand Canyon, you're like, oh my God, it's the Grand Canyon. And the third or fourth or fifth time, it's this big hole in the ground you're walking past on your way to the gift shop. That's repetition suppression. And it actually, it's energy efficiency in the brain. And, it's very helpful that way, but it definitely makes the new very, very familiar, very, very.
Yeah. Well, so what I noticed about the book, We Are As Gods, here's my takeaway in my simplified way, is that we got a lot of things where it's very abundant. There's exponential technologies that are here and still coming. I think one of the statistics that Kurzweiler said was, in the next decade, we're going to have 100 years of progress, right? So the question is that how do people understand this? So you talked about archetypes, you talked about analogies. There seems like there isn't an analogy or archetype for people to use right now to understand what is happening with our.
Yeah, it's worth backing up to the beginning of this. So
yeah,
our technology is accelerating. Our brain is not. Our brain evolved in an environment that was local and linear. Local meaning everything was roughly a day's walk away. Linear meaning the rate of change was pretty slow. Nothing really changed between generations. Today, we live in a world that's global. So something happens on the other side of the world, we hear about it a second later. And exponential, meaning the rate of change is insane, right? Forget about the difference between the generations. These days, it can be the difference between the weeks. Brain does not process information at that speed or that scale. This has a whole bunch of downstream impacts, one of which you've just talked about. When the brain encounters uncertainty, when it loses its ability to predict what's going to happen next, when things speed up and grow in speed and scale, and the brain can't predict what's about to happen, which is what brains are always doing. So at every moment of every day, your brain is saying, what is about to happen? How much energy do I need to meet this challenge? That's what it wants to know, and it wants to increase energy efficiency, because in the environment we evolved in, calories were really hard to come by. So wants to save calories at all costs by reducing uncertainty. Because when the future isn't surprising, right, we can match our behavior exactly. We know exactly what to do. It doesn't take a lot of energy. And that's what brains are designed to guide movement and increase efficiency. That's what that's sort of the order of brains. When the brain encounters uncertainty, it does a number of things by default to try to increase efficiency. One of them, which is what you were talking about, is it likes to reduce complex phenomenon to complicated phenomenon, and complicated phenomenon to simple phenomenon. So one of the examples that we use in the book to show how this works is the brain processes information through analogies, and we make comparisons between things, right? She's as hungry as a wolf. He's as big as a bear. Those are comparisons. Those are analogies the brain uses to take the complex and reduce it to the complicated. When analogies fail us, we tend to reduce down to archetypes. That's sort of the next step. And then when archetypes fail, we reduce down to apocalyptic tales. And that tends to be how things happen. And what's interesting, and this is what we did in the book, is if you measure the rise in like archetypal storytelling by counting literally up the number of like media properties that have superheroes and gods and goddesses, archetypal figures in them from the inventions of the computer on, they start to double exponentially each decade, and it's continued. And then a little later on, you start to see the exact same thing with apocalyptic stories. So the brain is trying to take something really complicated and reduce it to something really simple. That's one of the effects of living in a world where you can no longer predict the future and everything's moving at speed and scale.
So that brings the question. Just the other day, we heard the news that an AI agent went rogue from OpenAI and hacked into, or was trying to hack into Hugging Face. So I'm curious, in your opinion, right? Like for some people might say, whoa, that could be apocalyptic. But in your opinion, what are you hearing people saying is apocalyptic about all the technologies we're seeing? Like every day there is some new development.
Let me answer that question. But first, I got to ask for my answer to make sense. I got to talk a little bit about flow and flow science, which is sort of an optimal performance, which is the center of my work. And then I'll come right back to it. So I study peak performance. I study the neurobiology of peak performance, what goes on in the brain and the body when human beings are performing at their very best. And this work focuses on the state of flow, state of consciousness known as flow. It's defined as an optimal state of consciousness where emotions, cognition, and physical abilities all tend to skyrocket. I'll come back to that skyrocket in half a second, but let me, just so people know what I'm talking about. Flow is any of those moments of rapt attention when total absorption, you get so focused on the task at hand and what you're doing, everything else starts to melt away and disappear. Time is going to distort. Usually what happens is you just get so sucked into what you're doing that a couple hours go by in what feels like 2 minutes. And throughout, as I said, all aspects of performance, mental, physical, and emotional go through the roof. So let me talk about what I mean by through the roof for half a second, then we'll come back to your question. Of the things that flow amplifies, a couple of them that are really important to this discussion. One is productivity. So McKinsey, the business consultancy, spent 10 years. They went around the globe talking to leaders, business leaders, CEOs, and entrepreneurs, founders about how much more productive they were in flow than out of flow. And on average, after a 10-year study, they found that most executives report being 500% more productive in flow. That's a very big spike in productivity. It's massive. The Department of Defense was doing a similar study. They wanted to know how much does learning accelerate in flow. So they found soldiers in flow will learn about 230% faster than normal. Other studies have pushed that number up. We also see in my lab, creativity and innovation spike 400 to 700% above baseline. So here's why this is important. Right now, there is an apocalyptic story running everywhere, running amok, that AI is coming for our jobs. AI is going to take all our jobs. Techno unemployment, it's going to be everywhere. And that's an apocalyptic story. We can't understand AI. It scares us and we are confused by it. So we either go utopia. Oh my God, AI is going to be perfect. And this is, Demis Hammamdla saying AI is going to cure all disease in the next 10 years, right? That's utopia. Or we go apocalypse, right? Rogue AI, joblessness, etc. So here's why that's so problematic from where I sit, which is if you say AI is coming for our jobs, it's going to take all our jobs and we're going to have widespread technical unemployment. And we better get to UBI, universal basic income, really quickly, right? All those things that you're hearing. It obscures the real question. And the real question is the following. It's not AI is coming for our jobs. That's not what we've seen at all. What we've seen is that AI makes experts super dangerous. The problem is, how do you get young, early stage employees who are coming into companies and train them up to the expert level fast? That's the issue. We have a secondary issue that's not really here exactly unless you're a coder right now, which is how do we take older employees who have aged out of what they're doing and reskill them very quickly? That is a different question. And the reason it's a different question is we already know the answer. We know that the biology of optimal performance, optimal learning, optimal creativity, optimal productivity, optimal performance is flow. We understand the neurobiology. We understand where the state comes from, how to trigger it, how to work with it. We also know that if you're going to train people in new skills very, very quickly, you're going to use AI to do it. So the question you're really asking is, how do we couple flow and AI together to reskill people faster than ever before? That's a very different, you can start to answer. You even know where to start to answer. You know what I mean? And so it get in this apocalyptic story that we're telling, we're obscuring what is actually a much simpler question, one that has answers, and those answers have to be brought to scale. That's the issue. So this is one of the reasons we sort of wrote this book is old cognition in a new world defaults to ways of thinking that are actually dangerous and sort of obscure opportunity and or disguise opportunity as threat in a sense. And this is a great example.
Yeah. Yeah. I think later in the book, you actually have the 10 commandments listed out of how humans could work better with AI, right? To use
that's the other half of this, right? Which is, so the Flow Research Collective, when I actually founded this organization almost a decade ago, one of the reasons I did was this exact problem. I'm from Cleveland, sort of blue under the collar, grew up in that world. And I know that the largest blue collar workforce in America are truck drivers. And the autonomous trucks are going to replace all of their jobs as a general rule. Unless there might be some boutique trucking company where I want my Rolex watch and it's hand delivered by a human trucker. But other than that, other than bespoke ridiculousness, it's going to be autonomous. It takes about 15 years for a truck fleet to go extinct. So that won't happen completely until 2045. But we knew that, and I got a chance because I wrote about the first early autonomous cars very early on. So I rode around in the first Google autonomous car back in 2009 and 10. And I saw what was coming then. And then, when Elon started talking about the trucks, cyber trucks, you saw it. You're like, this is where it's going. It's very clear. Let's see if we can solve this problem. And we tried to get out ahead of it. On the AI stuff, we started to realize, crap, when humans work with AI, there are all kinds of problems with cognition. And we're hearing about this now. Cognitive overloading, cognitive offloading. If you actually look at what's being eroded There's about 12 different categories of cognition that AI threatens to jeopardize. And let me emphasize this because this is sort of crazy, but it wasn't my study. It was a friend of ours run out of the University of Miami, I believe. He took a group of business leaders. I want to say it was about 60, but I could be wrong there. And he let them use AI for 1 month to write all their emails. So they stopped writing emails. AI wrote their emails. And a month later, they came back and tried to write emails. And he was measuring how'd they do. What he found is after a month, executives literally lost the ability to write an email. They didn't know how to structure their thoughts. They couldn't spell, grammar had eroded. This is, by the way, that same energy efficiency paradigm we were just talking about, right? When you outsource a job, the brain goes, oh, I don't have to do that anymore, so I'm going to stop. So we saw this, cell phones, we don't remember numbers anymore. GPS showed up, we can't read maps anymore. The Google effect happens in kids now where they don't remember facts because they know they can look them up at their disposal. So AI is trickier because as much as it's this great tool that helps us reskill and really prepare for our future, if you use it wrong, it's going to actually erode cognition, creativity, innovation, problem solving, discernment. All these things get eroded, and they're the very things we need most to cooperate with AI and get maximum benefits. So those 10 laws you were talking about are merged out of our AI blind spots. Where were our blind spots and how can we protect against those so we don't actually make ourselves stupid in the process of using AI to like reach into the future? And this is the downside of up. Like we talk in the book about, we've moved into a world of abundance. That's true. You said at the beginning, we have an abundant amount of communication and computation technology in this. And, we have abundance of connective technology. We have social media. But we also have the largest mental health crisis in history caused by fractured attention and social media, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the downside of up. We have an abundance of communication technology, and now we have an abundance of mental health disorders. So there's a dark side to abundance is sort of my point here. We have an abundance of smartness, AI, and now we have an abundance of techno unemployment fears. So there's this counterbalancing energy here that you sort of have to deal with. And that's what those commandments were about.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of the story that really stuck with me, or the experiment that stuck with me, was the 1968 experiment, Universe 25, with all the mice.
Oh, that we closed the book with, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That was, and for those who don't know, correct me if I have this wrong, but basically over a period of almost 4 to 5 years, the scientists basically created a mouse metropolis and started with 4 mice, 2 females, 2 males, and let them reproduce. And over that 4 to 5 year period, there was never any disease, no starvation, none of that. Yet,
yeah,
what they saw
abundance of like raw materials, right? Food,
yes,
and space and breeding. It was John Calhoun. He was at the National Institute of Health. And he would literally, he was looking at materialism. He was coming out of the 50s and he was like, oh my God, stuff is showing up. We've got stuff for the first time, right? Plastic was this crazy invention. We had stuff. And he was like, well, wow, this is interesting. All mammals, including humans, evolved under conditions of scarcity. What happens if you create conditions of abundance? Like a utopia had been this old idea, but I don't think anybody had ever tried to like test it. And he was like, no, let's test it. And we'll use mice because they're very similar to humans in terms of their nervous system and whatever. And you can finish the story if you want, or I can.
Yeah. I mean, you're my guest. You can finish it.
It goes horribly wrong, right? Like society completely, it gets Mad Max in there. It's not even like it starts to devolve. The males become either like roving, marauding bands of violent male energy that just attack and try to kill anything on sight, or they just groom themselves endlessly. The females lost all of their social and maternal instincts. They would literally like walk away from infants while nursing. They would step over bodies of dead relatives, which is not something mice will ever do. And John Calhoun actually, and he was an ethologist. He studied animal behavior and spent his life studying animal behavior. He shut the experiment down early because it was just sort of too gruesome, and he just terminated the experiment. And his point was, hey, mice aren't all that different from humans. And we can go into the greater detail about it in a second if you want. But like, I think we're seeing the signs of that already starting to happen. We don't react well to a world of abundance. We evolved under conditions of scarcity to survive. Everything meaning making is tied to survival. Curiosity is tied to survival. Play, all these sort of foundational human attributes are tied to these things that are starting to be eroded by our technology. And this is like when we talked, Peter and I first talked about abundance back in 2012, it was this great thing. Like soon we'll have technology that's going to meet and exceed the basic needs of everyone on the planet. That's like an amazing promise. And we're not mad that a million people gained access to electricity, or 2 million, or excuse me, a billion people gained access to electricity and 2 billion gained access to clean drinking water over the past 10 years. That's amazing. That's the promise of abundance being fulfilled. But there's this very heavy dark side because of how our brain works that we constantly have to protect against.
Yeah. So I'll tell you the part of the book that literally it surprised me, Stephen. All right. I did not expect it to take this turn. The part that surprised me was mindset 2.0. And the reason why is like, I'm an executive coach. Okay. And all throughout that chapter, you were talking about, and I presume you wrote a majority of that chapter, right? Like about mindset, framing, biases.
So I will actually say Peter Divanis has been a mindset advocate for a long, long time. I tend to think, like a lot of entrepreneurs, he uses a less precise definition of what mindset is. And I'm a big fan of cognitive literacy. So the reason I broke it apart and said, hey, wait a minute, there's three things going on. There's frames, mindset, and bias. Is once you sort of understand how they work and how they work together, you have more power. You have way more power in this situation.
Yeah. And so relating that back to, the mouse universe 25 dystopia, right? It's, I think one of the conclusions or derivations from that was in a society where you lack purpose, the social norms will break down, your behaviors will change, where you lack autonomy, any mastery, creativity, flow, right? Like that all are ingredients for flow. That's where the society breaks down. And what was surprising, and yet this is what I do on a daily basis with corporate leaders, Stephen, is teaching mindset. And so the fact that it was all about mindset and how we need to change our minds, our mindsets and frames in order to get through this next, the next few decades, that really surprised me. So, but my question is that like, what's your take on it? Mindset, frame, biases, like where do you think we are right now? And where do you think we need to be in those three things?
That's an interesting question. So it's worth sort of backing into this a little bit, just to say that one of the most important things we know that's happened in science over the past 30 years is that the mind-body separation has been completely erased. There's no difference. Where I love to give an example of this is longevity, because you hear, and we wrote about all the stuff that's happening in longevity science, and it's really, really, really exciting. But I always point out to people, it's also very experimental. And if you go through the past 50 years of what we know about longevity, what are the interventions that really, really extend lifespan? It's mindset. Positive mindset towards aging gives you an extra 7.5 years of life. That's the largest gain you can get. The second largest gain is having a robust social life. These are mental changes that produce, right? If you have a robust social life or a positive mindset towards aging, that's better than being radically obese and losing all that weight, or being a heavy smoker and quitting. Like that's what we're talking about here in terms of its effects. So when I look at mindset, there were about 5 mindsets we talk about in the book. I think there's probably 6 that sort of matter. I think it's very useful to have an abundance mindset because we have a built-in scarcity mindset as a general rule, and we no longer live in conditions of scarcity most of the time. So it's worth thinking that way. An exponential mindset is really critical because we literally have an exponential or a linear bias, right? We don't notice exponential growth at all. And my favorite example of this is Elon Musk, who April of 2020.
You love Elon. You love Elon, don't you? You love Elon.
I will. No, I don't. Elon told the world that there would be no new cases of COVID. And I was like, well, that's not really how exponential growth works, Elon, and you should know this. It's my favorite example of it. Literally, like that's our linear bias, right? It's like that's a crazy thing, but that's a crazy example of it. But I think it's very funny. But learning how to think in terms of exponentials, learning to look at things and go, oh well, exponential double on a periodic basis, right? And so if you see a pond half covered in algae and ask when's it going to be completely covered, algae grows exponentially. So literally the answer is usually the next day. So that's what we don't see, right? So I think that's very useful. I think a creativity and a curiosity mindset is the most important weapon. In fact, when I run at the Flow Research Collective, I run one of the things I run is the Alliance, and it's sort of, I can't call it a mastermind because it's not exactly that. It's somewhere between a think tank and a boot camp. But one of the things we really focus on is training creativity and innovation because it's so foundational, and the creativity mindset is really important. Creativity tops most of the lists of the most important skills in the 21st century. And it's the skill that leaders never train. They just stop training creativity as a general rule. There are exceptions. There's certain jobs that are exceptions, but as a general rule, most leaders stop training creativity. So it's this giant lever that nobody takes advantage of. But if you actually, and it's a very trainable skill, which is the other thing. So those are a few of the mindsets that I think really matter in the 21st century.
Yeah. And so, I'm sure you have a lot of friends and loved ones around you or there might be some that are not in the right mindset right now. So how would you teach them to learn that curiosity, play, and creativity mindset if they don't have it already?
So this is interesting. Where I start is actually, it may surprise you, but do you know much about Zen Buddhism and Zen koan work?
I study it. Yeah. The impossible questions. Yeah.
Okay. So the very first, if you study Zen Buddhism, the very first koan you're often given to work with is mu. It's the answer to, does a dog have Buddha nature? And Buddha himself had said that all living beings have Buddha nature. They have the ability to become enlightened. This is all besides the point. But the answer is mu, which means no. But that's how it translates literally, but it doesn't exactly mean no. Sometimes it means not quite. Sometimes it means I think not. And what the exercise is really about is whenever sensation arises in your body, right? Your body will take raw sensation and make meaning out of it. And that's the gap between emotion and feeling. Once something becomes a feeling, you don't have a lot of flexibility with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the Zen exercise is whenever you start noticing raw sensation arising, question it. Are we sure it means what you think it means? That's a tiny little reframing exercise that just lets you question what's arising in consciousness. So when I'm working on mindset, I always start there, because it's a very little subtle framing thing. It's got a very long pedigree, which means we know it works. It's been working for thousands and thousands of years for a lot of people. And that's part of one of the things that makes Zen effective as sort of a performance technology more than anything else. That's how I think of it. I think about it as a performance technology. And so I start there. And then this is just, you got to start with frame, right? Mindset is enduring. It steers behavior a little bit unconsciously. So what you get to mess with is frame. How you interpret reality is your frame. So you can have an optimistic frame and negative. And all I tell people is, no matter what you believe, frames are flexible. they wiggle. So you can, play assumption games. Why do I believe this? What if I believe the opposite? All these things are meant to sort of loosen your frame. I'll give you another one that's really simple so I said a second ago, having a creativity mindset is really useful. One of the reasons it's hard to train creativity in adults is you've got to write, you've got to draw, you've got to actually be creative. And I love little drawing exercises, because if you're trying to learn to draw, you have to learn to look at the physical world as outlines and shapes and see negative space. And instead of seeing a toaster, you see a rectangle with a sort of parallelogram across the top, et cetera, et cetera. This loosens your frame. All of these things are ways of sort of loosening your frame. And I find it's worth playing those games for a couple of weeks just with your consciousness, and then really going into mindset and really sort of but all of these things are about sort of changing how we think. And I always say, if you find that even if that's too sticky, like if your frames are too locked in there, start by just doing breath work, right? Breath work, just follow your breath, because one of the things that happens as you do breath work is you start to notice this gap between emotion and feeling, and you can extend it a little bit. By the way, here's where we can go full circle, and then I'll shut up, on where you started this conversation. So we started this very conversation with repetition suppression. You said, how is it that dudes are flying on planes and demanding Wi-Fi, right? They're 30,000 feet in the air. Give me Wi-Fi in my flight. You're all pissed off. We don't get it. We don't notice we're actually flying in a spaceship, right? And it's amazing. When you do basic mindfulness, one of the things it does is it creates a beginner mind. It turns off repetition suppression, right? You get the raw sensation, not the feeling, the meaning you want to make from it immediately. And this starts to give you a little more space in your cognition for other choices. And the last thing I want to say here, I've been talking for a while, but this is so critical for leaders. This is how you spot opportunity. This is the exact mechanism that trains the brain to spot opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, the classic thing, and the CEO of my last company I was with said it the best, like beginner's mind. And what that is you see, like, there's chaos. Wow. I've never seen a better opportunity. Chaos is an opportunity. And you know what was interesting in what you mentioned there, Stephen, is that I think I'm not a scientist of the brain, but I went to this meditation conference a few months ago, and it was actually neuroscientists who were presenting their findings. And one of the things that I learned there, right in the first 5 minutes, was that when a human being sees something, like I see a camera here, I see a computer, but literally, if you deconstructed what your eyeballs actually see, it's just light rays. It's just stuff. It's only when your brain interprets and organizes all these light rays coming into your eyeballs and saying, I am seeing a laptop here. That's the meaning. That's the meaning layer. Now, there's many more layers to that. But if we're able to interrupt our brains when we just first feel that sensation, so whether it's a sensation of, I'm feeling fear, or I see this, if you can interrupt it before you put too much meaning into it, that is the role of meditation. Is how I feel it is. That is a role of reframing.
That's very eloquent. I agree with that.
Yeah, it's basically, if you think there was 4 layers they model it with, but basically stop it at the layer of I see this before you even interpret it. Just say I see this. What could it be? What could it be? And exactly what you're saying.
The brain vision is processed hierarchically in the brain. So when they talk about vision in the brain, you're exactly right. There's V1, which is sort of the lowest level, goes all the way up to V6. So if you look at what's actually seen at V1, it's just edges, contours, just like very basic shapes. Yet motion and color in these things start to build up, but it's not till like V4, V5, V6 that your brain goes, those 4 lines are actually legs on a chair. And that chair is, a mid-century modern chair. And that mid-century modern chair reminds me of my old boss who used to have it, right? That's all at the top of the hierarchy. And what they're suggesting is you can get in and sort of interrupt the process earlier on. And that's sort of what you're doing with reframing. It's interesting also, if I've been meditating for 25, 30 years at this point. It doesn't happen often, but you can actually even get back, you can watch raw sensation come into the brain and start to produce emotion. You can actually you can get further back in the process. It doesn't happen very often, or maybe it does if you're a better meditator than I, but I've had that
No, I'm not.
experience of like, wow, is this wild? This is really cool. The other thing I want to tell you that I think is so funny, I started my career, my mentor is a guy named Andrew Newberg, and he's the godfather of a field known as neurotheology. It's the use of brain imaging and other such techniques to study so-called spiritual experiences. And this was 30 years ago. He was studying meditation under the heading of neurotheology. So 2 days ago, myself and two other neuroscientists just published, it's the foundational textbook in the field of performance neuroscience, which over about the past 20 years has been built up into a field. And like 3 years ago, Springer Textbooks came to us and said, would you write the founding textbook? And we did. Andy Newberg, my mentor, has a article in that textbook on mindfulness. It is no different than the article on mindfulness that he wrote 30 years ago, except 30 years ago, it was neurotheology, and now it's peak performance. That's what's happened in 30 years in Western traditions.
Hey, anything to bring more awareness to it, I'm good with that. So I'd love to move on to another thought here, Stephen. So we talked a lot about where there's abundance, there's a dark side to abundance, but there's also it starts from up here, our mindsets and our mindsets, the framing, the biases, and challenging these things. I'm an optimist. I consider myself an optimist, realist. And I was talking about this interview I was going to have. I read the book and I was talking to a friend the other day and I go, oh man, I love this book because I do see a possibility of the future, extending life, aging, all that stuff. But then this person is a little more socially conscious than I am. And they go, Dave, put all that stuff aside. Who owns the abundance? And I had no idea how to answer that question. Is with all this abundance and technology, who owns it? And I didn't elaborate and ask him, where's it coming from? What do you mean who? But I want to ask you that question, as vague as it is. If someone asked you in a crowd right now and said, Stephen, who owns all this abundance? How would you frame that question and how would you answer it?
So honestly, I think that's a silly conspiratorial question that people they love to have boogeymen. It's just silly. It's silly. It's silly. I'll give you like a million reasons why, but let me just give you one classic example right now. You hear all these people talking about US versus China. We're having an AI war. Who's going to own the AI? And there's two things that people keep missing here. Thing one, if anybody's having an AI war, it's the US, because China keeps open sourcing their damn models. They're not fighting with anyone. They're literally open sourcing their models from DeepSeek forward. They're like, here, have it, whatever. We're the ones who are fighting an AI war. And we're ginning up an AI war for all kinds of reasons, basically because it helps sell more AI and people are raising money. So it's an absolute wag the dog situation as far as I'm concerned. Part one. Part two, the race to super intelligence is absurd because people are basically arguing that if by making LLMs, giving them more parameters and more data, we're somehow going to get to super intelligence. None of that is true. That's also a made up thing. And lost in all that is what we're seeing is like your friend is arguing for centralized control. And they're making an argument against centralized control because we came through a period of consolidation where the tech companies got a tremendous amount of control. that control is starting to wobble. How do we know? Because new AI models keep popping up every day, right? There's like 3 new models I've heard about in the past 3 weeks that are supposed to be better than all the other models. And, we're all going to go off, what we've been using that. This is going to keep happening. I'll give you another example, an older version of this. So when genetic editing, CRISPR, all that stuff, synthetic biology was sort of early days, 2010, 2011, 2012, right when that was starting to get a lot of attention, you had, and understandably so, a lot of like eugenetics fears. Oh my God, Gattaca, perfect children. We're going to head back to the Nazis. It's super dangerous. And I remember having a conversation with Dr. Andrew Hessel about it, who's literally one of the best synthetic biologists on the planet, alongside George Church. He's now the man in charge of the Human Genome Write Project, which is instead of reading a genome, it's to write the first human genome. And he said, look, I'm doing this work and I can tell you from the cutting edge, the one thing that I know is humans are endlessly creative. Look at the names people have for their children. Do we give them the same 10 names? No, because we want our children to have individuality, to be total expressions of ourselves. And as you get more freedom, the names explode. So with genetics, you're going to see the same thing. And you are, by the way, seeing this already. The people who are experimenting sort of with early genetic modification stuff, it's like coming out of punk rock subcultures. People are trying to get cat's eyes or grow tails or they're not trying to breed perfect children. They're like, that's what's happening. And with AI, what people are forgetting is this technology is becoming democratized. And it's easier and easier to build these systems, and nobody's building the same system. So who owns abundance argues that there's going to be some sort of centralized control and one winning model. And for one example, to give it the smartness of the example, and I don't see that working. I also, and we make this point in the book, and it's probably worth making, there is this argument that like the really big thing right now is the wealth gap. There's a handful of billionaires and everybody else basically. And again, think it's a silly argument. I don't think it's the point. Like, yes, humans have an innate sense of fairness and we get mad when those gaps exist. But what do we really care about? We care about a rising floor effect, which is exactly what's happening. The basic needs of everybody on the planet, it's easier than ever before to meet them. There are less people living in poverty. More people have opportunity. More people have rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's really what we're seeing. I don't care how rich the richest person in the world is. I could care less. What I care about is, does everybody have enough to eat? Does everybody have a place to sleep? Can everybody pursue their own dreams? That's what I care about. I could care less about the people at the top. I tend to think often when I hear arguments like that, yeah, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to just stop there.
I think I touched a nerve there.
Yeah.
I think I touched a nerve there, but
my team members are going to get mad at me. They're going to be like, Kotler, shut your trap.
We could edit this any way you want, or we could just leave it as is. But yeah, no, I remember that chapter where we did talk about the floor effects of basic wealth. The way I modeled it in my mind was like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We just basically raise that floor of where the hierarchy of needs are. So I think the example given was just cell phones, right? Like even the poorest nations in the world, a good chunk of the population has a cell phone nowadays. That was not true even a decade ago.
Well, but the other thing is when you make that argument, you have to take it the last step. You have to talk about value density, right? Value density is basically the cash value of all the shit you get for free in your cell phone, right? And we started looking at value density, Peter and myself, in abundance when we wrote our first book. And we looked at what's the value density of a 2010 cell phone if you could add up all the stuff you get for free in it that have been dematerialized, so the GPS and the encyclopedia and the movie camera and the record player and all that stuff. And a 2010 cell phone, the value density was amazing. It was like $1.5 million. That was amazing. But here's the greatest abundance story you can tell. Today, the average smartphone has a value density of like $7.4 million. And by the way, that's if you put out sort of cheap value on AI. And I don't know how you put a value on AI, but that's if you put a cheaper value on AI. And what that means is 7 billion people in access to goods and services just became like multimillionaires over the past decade, which is incredible. That's the wild story about the rising floor here, which is truly incredible. So as long as that continues to happen, I'm less concerned about what's going on at the top.
Okay. Well, Stephen, I have one last question for you. And if we were to talk 3 to 5 years from now, and we were to talk about the impact that your book, We Are as Gods, talking about abundance, in an ideal situation, what impact would you like it to have on society?
That's funny. I'm going to give you two answers. The first is that I always say that's above my pay grade. That's not my job. My job is to write the book, and my job is to talk about it in public so other people can hear about it. But impact that's other people's work as much as it's mine. I will say that what matters most to me is that I think it's important that we all realize, I don't know if this is but this is this is how we stay safe and thrive. We have to realize that the so-called soft skills of the 20th century, right? So creativity was a soft skill, focus and attention. These were soft skills, problem solving, flow, mindset, very soft skill, right? Passion, purpose. I entered the business world in the late 80s and the early 90s. And if I would have walked into like a board meeting or even an editorial meeting for like some of the magazines I was working on when I was a journalist and been like, you know what we need here? We need more passion. We need more purpose. And we need to train creativity collectively as a group. I would have been laughed. I would have been laughed out of the room the first time. I would have been annoying people the second time. And the third time I would have been fired. Like, probably. So here in the 21st century, these are hard skills. Hard meaning we have to train them to thrive. And if we don't train them, the technology itself is going to erode them. So if we're not training creativity and we're said outsourcing it to AI, we're getting worse, not better, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So I think impact is above my pay grade, but the message that I hope is leaking out is that we need to be training these skills to really thrive in a world of abundance and mitigate the dark side of technology and have that optimistic future that I think both you and I think is possible.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much. Thank you very much for making the time today. But also thank you very much for you and Peter for writing this book and just bringing to the attention that a lot of life and a lot of our very survival is about our mindsets. The things around creativity, purpose, autonomy, mastery, connection, that is not fluffy stuff. Those are tough skills and hard skills to build. And that's why it's worth doing, because that's how we're going to thrive. That's my message coming out of this. And I hope the folks listening here are also getting that message. So, Stephen, if people need to find you and see what you're up to over the next little while, what's up? You have another book coming out or another book tour?
I literally just followed up that with a textbook. So I do. There I am finishing another book, but it won't be out till 2028. And then I can tell you that another book after that. 2029 is going to be a novel. I publish sci-fi, right, as well. When I always tell people I'm not a futurist. So when I have to do a book like this or one of these things, I have to create a world that I think these technologies and then tell a story in it. So there's a couple more books coming. You can find me at StephenKotler.com, flowresearchcollective.com, and at Stephen Kotler on the socials.
Well, Stephen, pleasure having you here today. And for everyone listening, thank you. If you stayed to the end here, if you like this episode, please like, subscribe, smash that love button on the socials, and share this with your friends. I will see you all next time. Ciao. That's a wrap on this episode of the Coachful Coaching Leadership Podcast. I'm David Fung, and my mission is to help leaders grow, lead with impact, and build thriving teams. If you found this valuable, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a fellow leader. Until next time, keep leading with purpose.